Joining us now, NFL insider writer for The Athletic, Michael Lombardi. Michael, thanks for being with us. I want to look ahead to 2022 and that free agent class, and maybe start at the very top of the list with the Steelers' T.J. Watt. What do you see them doing here? Do you see them putting the franchise tag on him? What's his future like in Pittsburgh?
Well, I think a lot of that's going to depend on where we go. Do we get fans back in the stands? Does the COVID impact and us being vaccinated as a country allow fans to come see games and to have the owners get that revenue, which then gets passed on to their partners, which are the players? So I think if the cap goes up a little bit, and most teams are being told the cap will increase a little bit and then a lot in 2023. I think the Steelers are planning on franchising TJ Watt so that they can have him next year, even if the cap doesn't go up significantly, and then extend his contract when we see a huge increase based on the new TV revenues, based on being at least a year outside of COVID.
When do you think some of those answers will become clearer about teams and revenue, how much they have, how much they can spend, all that sort of stuff?
It won't come until next, it took a long time for the cap to come into place this year because the owners had to sort through it. Plus, they negotiated with the union on a final number. I would suspect sometime in late February of next year, we'll know that. I'm sure the Steelers are planning as if they know the cap number for TJ Watt and they have to work around it. Now, remember, the Steelers get a huge advantage. Next year, Ben's cap number will shrink completely. They can make a move, and into that cap number will then become TJ Watt's cap number. So they have ways of doing it.
Will Ben Roethlisberger end his career in a different uniform, you think?
I don't think so. I think them bringing him back this year, for me, based on the way he played, especially late in November and December. I think when you look at older players, you always evaluate not what they do in September, but how they play in November and December. As they get older, as it becomes harder. Ben didn't play well down the stretch. He threw the ball, a lot of checkdowns. He wasn't throwing it down the field. Their offense struggled. Their offensive line struggled. So I think he's got a lot to prove that he can be the same player he was the same player he was 3 years ago this year. I think that's going to be a huge challenge.
Will there always be a need with some of maybe the bottom level tier teams, not necessarily a Super Bowl contender, for that veteran presence at quarterback? I mean, if he is able to string together a somewhat impressive season, does that interest exist for players like that?
I think most teams, you have to compare it to what is in the 2022 draft class quarterback-wise. And a lot of people feel like that draft class could be better than this draft class. So would you rather go with a veteran for 1 year like the Indianapolis Colts did with Phillip Rivers last year? Or would you rather just move on and find your air replacement? Most teams would rather just move on.
One stat I was looking at while we're on this topic that I thought was interesting, Michael, is that the only quarterbacks drafted in the top 10 to win a Super Bowl in the last 25 years were either named Manning or Mahomes. Does that surprise you?
No, I think it's one of the, Bill Walsh said to me in 1984, Carolyn, he said, very few people can evaluate the quarterback and even fewer can coach him. And I think this is really what we've seen in quarterback evaluations through the mock drafts, through the media, through NFL teams, is there's a lot of people that just watch the player play and really don't understand how they play. And I think they miss a big component. If you look at Alex Smith's career, he just retired. He was the perfect example of when scheme and talent came together. His first 5 or 6 years in San Francisco were not very good. In fact, year 3, he threw below 50%. But once he got with Jim Harbaugh and Greg Roman, then he went to Kansas City with Andy Reid, and his skill set matched the offense. He became much better as a player. And I think there's a large element of that missing in the NFL, particularly when it relates to evaluating quarterbacks.
How would you assess the top of this year's draft and the quarterbacks that are in there compared to some of the previous classes we've seen so far?
Well, there's a lot of uncertainty. I mean, look, Zach Wilson is a very talented young man. He got hurt as a junior or sophomore. Then he came back this year and played really well in an abbreviated schedule. The only game he lost was at Coastal Carolina, and he had his team on the 2-yard line trying to go back and win that game. I think it's going to be the system has to match the player's talent. Here's what I tell people all the time. When Dan Marino turned 24, until the time he turned 29, with the winningest coach in all of NFL history, Don Shula, on the sideline, he never went to the playoffs. So it's more than just a quarterback that helps you win. You need a great quarterback, but you also need the right system around the quarterback. You also need the right defense that fits the player, and everything has to work in perfect harmony. Now, I think Trevor Lawrence has had a unique skill set. I think people are nitpicking his game now, saying this isn't as good. They like Wilson better. I see Trevor Lawrence as a generational talent. And I think that as we look this draft, we know one thing, Carolyn. There'll be 5 quarterbacks, maybe 6 picked in the first round. If 2 are really good players, then it was a successful draft.
It's interesting to hear you talk about how different players fit into different schemes and just how specific it is with what teams are looking for and who may or may not fit, regardless of their natural talent and ability. When you're assessing a quarterback, what is the number one thing that you look for that is an intangible that cannot be taught or developed, that sort of thing?
If he can lead the team, because you want your team to get its personality from the head coach and the quarterback. You want to watch him lead the team. You want to see what he can do. Now, there were times where great quarterbacks like Joe Montana wasn't always the most vocal leader, but Joe's competitiveness was really obvious to anybody who was around him. So that led the team through his quietness, but through his competitiveness. So what I want is somebody who can lead through some way, through winning, through competitiveness, and they find a way to win. They'll do anything in their power to make sure they put the team in position to win. And I think that's the number one trait. Then we get into accuracy and all the other playing specifics. But if you don't have that, will to be great, to be the best player on the field, to lead the team, it's hard to be a great quarterback.
Just lastly on this, Michael, before we move on, I mean, now more than ever, the developments that we've seen in technology and players' diets, whatever the new, shiny object is. It seems like now more than ever, we're living in an era of player empowerment where guys have access to so much stuff that maybe they didn't have decades ago. So do you think that now more than ever, teams are able to find that leader, the guy that has those qualities, and then fix and adjust the rest in terms of accuracy, physical development, and make a guy with intangibles fit the style that they want that player to play?
Well, I mean, if you listen to Daniel Kahneman, the Nobel Prize winner on organizational and decision making, he would say that we're in a world where there's too much information, there's too much noise on the outside that's affecting our decision making on the inside. And I think a lot of that is, I think, to come to the degree. Now, what I would say, because of the ingenuity in terms of health and care, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, the average age of an NFL quarterback started to decline at 32. And by the time he was 35, his career was over. We're not seeing that anymore. 40 is the new 35. 40, it might be the new 33, the way these guys can train and take care of their bodies. But in terms of the evaluation, it still comes down to somebody having an expertise in the field that understands what system is best suited for the player. It's really no secret that Andy Reid can find Patrick Mahomes or find Alex Smith or find Donovan McNabb because he knows what he wants. And that is half the battle.
That's interesting. All right, let's get back to a couple of these guys, the NFL free agent class of 2022. I want to ask you about Davante Adams, the Packers wide receiver, obviously one of the best in the game. What do you see the long-term future between the Packers and Davante Adams being?
Well, the Packers are not a team that spends in free agency. They signed Aaron Jones. They let him go out there, and then they signed him before he really became a free agent. I would suspect the same thing. I think they'll either franchise Davante Adams or they'll sign him to a long-term tier. Here's what I do know. Very few players in the NFL are truly number one receivers. It's a term we throw around loosely. It's not always there on the film. And I think that Davante Adams is a number one receiver. So you've got to pay for quality.
Michael, do you think the 49ers should sign Fred Warner to a long-term extension?
I think in their scheme, Carolyn, he fits perfectly, right? Today's football game is really about the middle linebacker having speed. When he can run fast, then your defense looks fast. The old days of a run-stopping middle linebacker don't exist anymore. It's about range of the passing game. The teams that play best in the red zone have a middle linebacker that can run. And Warner can do that, and he also can play the run. Rodgers' commentary about him being one of the best players he ever played against is because of his ability to be instinctive in both the run and the passing game. And when you find a player like that, you better sign him to a long-term deal.
All right, let's just end with Saquon Barkley. How much interest do you think Saquon Barkley would have on the open market?
Well, I mean, look, he's a very talented player, uniquely athletic. He can do things in the running and the passing game, but, injuries have been an issue. So durability is as much a part of ability. And whenever you take a running back who's coming off a major surgery like an ACL, you're always a little reluctant. How can he get his game back to the same level that it once was? So I think that would be a buyer beware type of situation. He'll have tremendous interest because of where he was drafted and his stock coming out of college, but we've yet to see that on a consistent basis in the NFL.
At what point do teams get excited about the possibility of some of these guys projecting ahead to 2022, Michael? And of course, with everything that's happened with revenue in the NFL, we're in a bit of a wild, wild west situation here with some of that revenue ultimately making its way back into the hands of spenders. But, when do teams really start to say, okay, this guy will probably get franchise tagged, this guy probably won't be available, but X, Y, and Z make us really excited?
I think once the draft's over, then you start working on next year's draft and you start working on next year's free agency class. Because what you really want to do in free agency is you want to watch the player on the opposing team as if he was on your team. And that means you want to watch him every single week. You want to watch him have his high moments and his low moments. To put a tape on of the highlights of a player from one season doesn't really do it service. You need to watch him as the year goes on. And I think you set that board in May, and then you start examining it during the season.
All right, Michael Lombardi, thanks so much. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Carolyn.